I am Maya, 33 years old. On our 5th anniversary night, my father-in-law kept insulting me from the main stage, calling me a charity case. But when I spoke back, exposing their corporate secret, my husband slapped me across the face in front of 600 guests. Everyone laughed. I wiped the blood from my mouth, took off my ring, and made one call. Dad, please come. Let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to a toxic family. The Plaza Hotel ballroom overflowed with New York elite for a double celebration: the Vanguard Real Estate Gala and my 5th wedding anniversary with Julian. I stood beside my husband near the stage, playing the quiet wife. I played this role flawlessly for 5 years, hiding my success as a financial consultant to not overshadow his fragile ego. Julian squeezed my waist to maintain my posture. On the stage, Richard, the patriarch of the Vanguard Empire, tapped his glass for silence. "Thank you for joining us tonight," Richard began. "Tonight we celebrate Vanguard Real Estate, but we also celebrate my son Julian and his marriage to Maya." Polite applause rippled through the crowd. I forced a smile. "Julian has been a phenomenal asset," Richard continued, looking directly down at me. "But my son has one fatal flaw. He has a bleeding heart." 5 years ago, Julian went to a community college job fair and picked up an orphaned girl doing petty consulting work to pay her rent. The room grew quiet. Julian chuckled softly at his father's insulting words. "He did not defend me. He never did. He brought her into our home," Richard projected louder. "He gave her our prestigious last name. He elevated her from poverty to Manhattan society. So please raise your glasses to Maya. Consider her Vanguard's biggest charity project to date." Cruel laughter erupted. 600 wealthy guests chuckled, amused by the spectacle of the poor orphan girl being put in her place. I looked at Julian, expecting him to stop this humiliation. Instead, he raised his glass and grinned, participating in my degradation. Across the room, Julian's sister, Victoria, clinked her glass with her husband, Marcus. Marcus, an African-American tech entrepreneur who married into the family for their venture funding, gave me a mocking salute. For 5 years, I had swallowed their endless insults. I had endured snide comments about my lack of pedigree, the reminders that I was nothing before Julian saved me. I kept my real identity and financial power hidden because I wanted a family that loved me for me. Looking at their laughing faces, a cold realization washed over me. They did not want a family member. They wanted a punching bag. I stepped away from Julian's grip, walking toward a passing waiter carrying a wireless microphone meant for the event coordinator. I picked it up. The feedback whined sharply through the speakers, cutting through the laughter and plunging the entire ballroom into dead silence. I looked directly at Richard on the stage, my voice steady when I spoke. "The only charity happening in this room tonight is my continued silence regarding the $40 million Vanguard fabricated in your third-quarter revenue reports." The collective gasp from the crowd was deafening. Investors and board members stared at me in shock. Richard turned the color of wet ash. He dropped his microphone, the metallic thump echoing across the marble floor. I did not have time to lower my hand before Julian lunged at me. He closed the distance in 2 strides, his face contorted with rage. He swung his arm back and slapped me across the face with absolutely everything he had. The brutal force threw me off balance. I crashed onto the marble floor, my ears ringing. The sharp, burning pain bloomed instantly across my left cheek, and the distinct metallic taste of blood filled my mouth. "Shut your mouth!" Julian screamed, standing over me with clenched fists. "Do not you dare bring your trashy upbringing into my family legacy. You are nothing but a lying, ungrateful leech." Not a single person moved to help me. The security guards stood frozen by the exits. Over by the VIP tables, Victoria and Marcus had their phones out, recording my physical assault with glee. Marcus pointed his phone directly at my bleeding face, laughing loudly as he captured the humiliating footage for his wealthy tech friends. I pushed myself up very slowly. My cheek throbbed relentlessly, but I felt absolutely no urge to cry. The grand illusion of my loving marriage was completely shattered, leaving behind nothing but cold, hard clarity. I wiped the fresh blood from my split lip with the back of my trembling hand. I looked up at Julian, whose chest was heaving with unchecked anger and entitlement. I reached for my left hand and slowly pulled the heavy 2-carat diamond wedding ring off my finger. Julian watched me do this, a deeply smug smile returning to his face, clearly assuming I was finally surrendering to his dominance. Instead, I dropped the ring into his half-full champagne glass. It sank to the bottom with a tiny splash. I turned my back on my abuser and walked down the center aisle of the ballroom. The massive crowd parted for me like the Red Sea, stepping aside in absolute stunned silence. I pushed through the heavy gilded doors and stepped out into the quiet, pristine luxury of the Plaza Hotel lobby. My hands were steady as I reached into my silk clutch and pulled out my cell phone. I dialed the one number I had sworn I would never use to fight my battles. The line clicked open on the first immediate ring. "Dad," I said, staring at my bloody reflection in the giant lobby mirror. "Bring the Vanguard acquisition files. I am done playing nice." I lowered my phone and tucked it securely into my silk clutch. Before I could even take a single step toward the revolving brass doors of the plaza lobby, a heavy hand grabbed my bare shoulder, spinning me around with brutal force. Julian had followed me out of the ballroom. He was not alone. Flanking him was Arthur Pendleton, the ruthless lead corporate attorney for Vanguard Real Estate, a man who had spent his entire career making Richard and Julian's massive financial messes disappear. Arthur clutched a thick manila folder against his tailored suit, looking around nervously to ensure there were no reporters in the immediate vicinity. Julian did not waste a single second. He lunged forward and slammed the heavy folder directly against my chest. The sharp edge of the thick paper cut painfully into my collarbone. I had to grab the file with both hands just to keep it from crashing to the polished marble floor. "Sign it right now," Julian hissed. His face was flushed a deep, angry red, his breath reeking of expensive vintage champagne and blind, unchecked aggression. "You are leaving this hotel and my life tonight, and you are leaving with absolutely nothing." Arthur stepped forward, pulling a heavy silver fountain pen from his breast pocket. He offered it to me with the cold, detached professionalism of a hired hitman. "This is a standard and immediate dissolution of marriage," Maya Arthur stated nervously, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses. He refused to make eye contact with me, fully aware of the highly unethical nature of ambushing a physically assaulted woman in a public hotel lobby. "It is bundled with an ironclad permanent non-disclosure agreement. You will sign both documents immediately. Do not make this harder than it has to be. Vanguard employs an absolute army of litigators. If you refuse, we will freeze your personal bank accounts, bury you in endless discovery motions, and tie you up in vicious litigation for the next decade, until you cannot even afford to buy groceries." I looked down at the documents resting in my hands. My left cheek was still burning furiously from where Julian had struck me minutes earlier in front of 600 people. The warm, metallic taste of blood lingered heavily on my tongue, but my mind had never been clearer. The initial physical shock had entirely faded, replaced by a cold, calculating precision. "You leave with exactly the clothes on your back," Julian sneered. He stepped into my personal space, attempting to use his height to intimidate me, a pathetic predatory tactic he had relied on for our entire 5-year marriage. He wanted to make me feel small, to remind me of the power dynamic he falsely believed he controlled. "You leave just like you arrived. Do you remember when I picked you up from that pathetic community college job fair? You were wearing a cheap, ill-fitting polyester suit, practically begging for entry-level consultant work. You were a total nobody. You did not even have a family to invite to our wedding." He laughed, a harsh, ugly sound that echoed loudly in the cavernous, opulent lobby. "I gave you a life, Maya. I took a struggling, desperate orphan, and I gave you the Vanguard name. I let you live in a $30 million penthouse. I let you wear my family's historic diamonds. I introduced you to high society. You have absolutely nothing without my last name. You are nothing without me." I did not flinch. I did not cry. The panic, the begging, and the total submission they were so desperately waiting to see never arrived. I simply opened the heavy manila folder and began to read the punitive clauses Arthur had hastily drafted. The terms were utterly draconian, designed by cruel men to completely destroy a woman's future. There was an absolute waiver of any and all alimony. I was claiming zero marital assets, relinquishing all legal rights to our shared penthouse, overlooking Central Park, the luxury vehicles, and the joint investment accounts. Accounts I knew intimately because I had secretly funded them and managed their explosive growth to keep his failing, poorly researched ventures afloat over the past 3 years. He had squandered millions, and I had quietly replaced every cent to protect him. Then came the gag order. It was a masterpiece of legal intimidation. If I ever spoke a single word about Vanguard Real Estate, Julian Richard, or the physical assault that had just occurred in the ballroom, I would be subject to an immediate $50 million financial penalty. They wanted to ensure I would spend the rest of my life in silent, terrified poverty, too afraid to ever speak the truth about their corrupt empire. I looked up from the harsh legal print. Julian was watching me, his arms crossed over his chest, a deeply arrogant smirk playing on his lips. He was waiting for me to break down. He was waiting for the poor, desperate orphan to drop to her knees and beg for a second chance to plead for a tiny fraction of a settlement just to survive the month. He desperately wanted me to cry. Instead, a slow, chilling smile spread across my face. Arthur shifted his weight nervously, clearly unsettled by my complete lack of panic. Julian's arrogant smirk faltered for a fraction of a second, a brief flash of utter confusion crossing his eyes. I reached out and took the silver fountain pen from Arthur's rigid hand. I did not pause to consult an outside lawyer. I did not ask for a single revision or clarification. I flipped straight to the signature pages at the back of the thick packet. With swift, elegant strokes, I signed my name on the divorce decree. I flipped to the next tab and signed the brutal non-disclosure agreement. I signed away the penthouse. I signed away the sports cars. I signed away any legal claim to Julian's highly toxic fabricated wealth. Done, I said quietly, snapping the heavy folder shut. Julian let out a sharp, triumphant breath, his blind arrogance instantly returning in full force. He snatched the folder roughly from my hands and shoved it back at his lawyer. Smart girl, Julian gloated, adjusting the crisp cuffs of his tailored tuxedo. At least you finally learned your proper place. Now get out of my sight before I call the hotel security to throw you out into the street like the trash you are. Do not ever try to contact me again. I handed the silver pen back to Arthur, who looked entirely bewildered by how easy and frictionless this transaction had been. I looked Julian dead in the eyes, letting him see the absolute void, where my affection, my loyalty, and my patience for him used to live. You are completely right, Julian. I said, my voice perfectly level and devoid of any emotion. I do not need your last name. I am just taking my real one back. I turned around and walked purposefully toward the massive revolving glass doors of the Plaza Hotel. The bellhops and valets were scrambling outside in the freezing torrential rain that had just begun to sweep across Manhattan. Wealthy guests were angrily huddled under the grand awning, fighting over the few available yellow cabs. Julian yelled something highly derogatory behind me, likely assuming I was about to walk out into the freezing downpour to wait for a cheap rideshare or violently navigate the crowded subway system in a soaked evening gown. Let her drown out there, I heard him tell Arthur, laughing cruelly. I pushed through the heavy brass and glass doors and stepped out into the freezing night air. The biting wind instantly whipped my hair across my face, but I did not walk toward the chaotic taxi line. I stood completely calmly at the very edge of the flooded curb, entirely ignoring the miserable weather. Within 10 seconds, the blinding headlights of 3 massive, black, heavily armored SUVs cut directly through the busy, congested traffic of Fifth Avenue. They were military-grade transport vehicles, the exact kind utilized by visiting heads of state. They completely bypassed the valet line, ignoring the angry honks and shouts from other drivers, and aggressively pulled up right to the curb, completely blocking the main hotel entrance and forcing the plaza's valets to scramble out of the way. The doors of the lead SUV swung open in perfect unison. 4 men in dark, tailored suits and earpieces stepped out into the pouring rain. The lead driver immediately snapped open a large black umbrella and rushed forward, holding it over my head to completely shield me from the storm. He opened the heavy bulletproof rear door of the vehicle for me. I stepped inside the luxurious soundproof interior, leaving Julian staring through the lobby glass in absolute bewildered shock as my private motorcade sped away into the night. Monday morning arrived with the suffocating weight of an execution. At exactly 8:55, the atmosphere inside the Vanguard real estate boardroom was toxic with pure, unadulterated panic. The panoramic glass walls offering sweeping views of the Manhattan skyline did nothing to alleviate the feeling that the room was rapidly running out of oxygen. Richard paced the length of the massive mahogany table, his usually immaculate silver hair completely disheveled and his face the color of wet ash. He muttered frantically to himself, his knuckles turning white as he clutched a stack of printed financial ledgers. Those ledgers detailed the sudden aggressive overnight sale of Vanguard's entire corporate debt. Julian sat slumped in his leather chair, nursing a vicious hangover from his weekend of premature celebration. He pressed a cold glass of water against his temple, attempting to project an air of calm arrogance that completely failed to reach his bloodshot eyes. He had spent Sunday bragging to the board about how effectively he had put his leech of a wife in her proper place, boasting about the ironclad divorce decree and the non-disclosure agreement he had forced me to sign. He truly believed getting rid of me was his greatest triumph. Across from him, Marcus aggressively bounced his knee against the table leg, his face buried in his trembling hands. Marcus had not slept a single second since his $20 million venture capital funding vanished into thin air on Friday night. He looked sick, his designer tech vest wrinkled, and his usual smug demeanor entirely erased. Victoria stood by the espresso machine, furiously biting her manicured nails, occasionally snapping at Marcus to stop shaking the table. She was terrified of losing her country club memberships and her fleet of luxury cars. They were all cornered. A mysterious entity operating through a labyrinth of offshore holding companies had aggressively purchased every single outstanding loan, mortgage, and line of credit Vanguard owed. The new majority stakeholder held enough leverage to instantly liquidate the entire family empire before lunch. The demand delivered to Richard had been clear and absolute. Be in the boardroom at 9 sharp or face total catastrophic bankruptcy. The antique grandfather clock in the corner of the room struck 9. Every head snapped toward the heavy oak double doors. The brass handles clicked and the doors swung open with a smooth, heavy glide. I walked into the boardroom. I was not wearing the cheap, ill-fitting polyester suits Julian loved to relentlessly mock, nor was I wearing the restrictive, suffocating designer gowns his mother had forced upon me for society galas. I wore a razor-sharp, custom-tailored charcoal power suit, my posture completely rigid, my expression utterly void of mercy. Flanking me, in a tight, impenetrable formation, were 5 of the most ruthless, high-powered corporate litigators in the financial district. The sharp click of my heels against the marble floor echoed like a countdown. I did not pause. I did not offer a greeting. I walked straight past Julian's gaping mouth, past Victoria's frozen stare, and bypassed Richard entirely. I pulled out the oversized leather chairman's seat at the very head of the table, the throne Richard had fiercely occupied for 30 years, and I sat down. My lead counsel smoothly placed a thick stack of embossed legal documents directly in front of me. For 5 agonizing seconds, no one moved. The Vanguard board members were paralyzed by a bizarre mixture of absolute confusion and rising indignation. Julian was the first to break the heavy silence. He slammed his palms down flat on the mahogany table, knocking over his water glass. "Maya, are you completely insane?" Julian screamed, his voice cracking with unchecked rage. "Security! Get this psychotic woman out of here before the new owner arrives. How did you even get past the lobby desk? I had Arthur file the divorce and the non-disclosure agreement on Friday night. You do not belong here. You do not own anything. You are legally barred from stepping foot in this building." Victoria chimed in, her voice shrill and panicked. "Get out of here right now, you bitter loser. We are waiting for the new majority stakeholder of this company. If they walk in here and see some pathetic divorce charity case sitting in the chairman's seat, they will liquidate us on the spot." Marcus suddenly stood up his chair, scraping violently against the floor. He pointed a shaking finger directly at my face, his eyes wide with paranoid realization. It was her, Victoria. I am telling you, she was the one talking about the morality clause right before my funding got frozen. She is a corporate spy. She knows the silent investor. She set us all up. Richard finally found his voice. He leaned heavily against the table, glaring at me with the same condescending disgust he had shown me at the anniversary gala. Maya, you have exactly 10 seconds to vacate my chair before I have you thrown into a police cruiser. I took you in from a community college job fair. I gave you food, shelter, and a respected name, and this is how you repay my unmatched generosity, by crashing the most critical meeting in Vanguard's entire corporate history. I did not flinch. I slowly unbuttoned my suit jacket, leaned back in the leather chair, and steepled my fingers together. The utter silence from my end only infuriated them further. I said, "Get security!" Julian roared, his face turning a dangerous shade of crimson. He lunged toward the wall panel and smashed his fist against the emergency intercom button. "Get Reynolds up here right now. We have a trespasser in the executive suite. Bring handcuffs." The heavy oak doors opened immediately. Reynolds, the imposing 6'4" head of Vanguard's private security detail, stepped into the boardroom. His face was a mask of cold, unreadable professionalism. "Thank God," Julian spat, pointing aggressively at me. "Grab this psychotic woman and drag her out of the building. Throw her onto the pavement where she belongs." Reynolds did not look at Julian. He did not reach for his radio. He walked with heavy, deliberate footsteps straight past Julian, past Richard, and past Marcus. He came to a halt directly behind my chair. He turned to face the family, crossed his massive arms over his chest, and stood at absolute attention, forming a human shield at my back. The collective confusion in the room morphed instantly into suffocating terror. Julian took a stumbling step backward, his eyes darting frantically from Reynolds to my entirely unbothered expression. I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the polished mahogany. I let a slow, chilling smile spread across my face as I looked directly into Julian's terrified eyes. "Sit down, Julian," I said, my voice echoing off the glass walls with absolute, unquestionable authority. "The new owner is already here." My lead litigator, a striking woman in a pristine white suit, stepped forward with mechanical, terrifying precision. She lifted the massive stack of heavily embossed documents she had carried into the room and dropped them directly onto the exact center of the mahogany table. The heavy thud echoed like a gunshot in the silent glass enclosed space. "Allow me to formally introduce the majority stakeholder of this firm." My lead counsel announced, her voice projecting effortlessly across the boardroom. "You are currently looking at Ms. Maya Sterling, Chief Executive Officer of Sterling Holdings, and the sole owner of exactly 68% of Vanguard Real Estate corporate debt." Julian collapsed backward into his leather executive chair as if he had been physically struck by a freight train. The blood completely drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly, translucent white. His mouth hung open, but the arrogant insults he usually hurled at me were entirely trapped in his throat. Beside him, Marcus gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles turning white, his breathing shallow and erratic. Richard stared at me, his hands trembling violently where they rested on the polished wood. He looked like a man watching the solid ground beneath his feet turn to quicksand. "Sterling." He finally stammered, his usually commanding voice reduced to a pathetic, breathy wheeze. "Victor Sterling's daughter." He gripped the edge of the table, struggling to remain upright. "But you told us you were an orphan. You sat at my dinner table and said you were drowning in student debt. You let us pay for your wedding dress. You let us treat you like a charity case." I leaned forward, resting my elbows lightly on the table, my posture relaxed but completely dominant. "I said my mother passed away when I was young, which is a fact. I said I paid my own way through school, which is also a fact. I intentionally chose not to use a single cent of my family money because I wanted to build a career entirely on my own merit." I paused, letting the heavy, suffocating silence stretch across the room. More importantly, I hid my father's identity because I desperately wanted a husband who loved me for who I was. not for my trust fund, my corporate connections, or my access to billions in liquid capital. I looked directly at Julian, watching him physically shrink under my gaze. Clearly, I failed spectacularly on the husband part. Julian tried to speak, but only a pathetic croak escaped his throat. The realization that the woman he had physically abused, publicly humiliated, and literally thrown out onto the street was the heir to an empire that dwarfed his own was completely short-circuiting his brain. Richard gasped for air, his perfectly tailored suit wrinkling as he slumped forward. He had spent years lecturing me about the superiority of the Vanguard legacy, entirely oblivious to the fact that I came from a lineage that could buy and sell his entire company before morning coffee. I reached out and opened the thick folder my counsel had dropped on the table. I flipped to the first tab and slid a detailed financial summary across the polished wood directly toward Richard. The paper stopped right at his fingertips. "You genuinely thought I was a charity case, Richard?" I said, my voice sharp and unrelenting. "You thought you were doing me a massive favor by letting me marry into your prestigious family. You thought you were the powerful patriarch rescuing a poor girl from mediocrity. Let us review the actual reality of your financial situation." I tapped the top of the document with my index finger. For the last 3 years, Vanguard has been bleeding capital at a catastrophic rate. Julian has routinely poured millions into commercial developments that were universally flagged by every analyst in the city as guaranteed failures. He bought unzoned swampland in Florida. He invested in bankrupt strip malls in Ohio. He single-handedly nearly tanked this entire family operation with his blind arrogance and absolute lack of business acumen. Julian shrank down further in his seat, desperately avoiding eye contact with his father. Richard turned a furious, betrayed glare toward his son, the reality of the numbers sitting right in front of him. Vanguard did not miraculously survive those massive, embarrassing losses. I continued ensuring every single person in the room heard the absolute truth. For 36 months, Sterling Holdings has been secretly injecting massive amounts of liquid capital into your accounts under the guise of anonymous angel investors. I used my personal wealth to cover your son's embarrassing incompetence. I saved Vanguard from total bankruptcy 3 separate times because I mistakenly believed I was protecting my husband and our future. You did not give me a life, Julian. I bought yours. Victoria suddenly slammed her hands on the table, her designer bracelets clattering loudly against the wood. "That is illegal!" she screamed, her voice shrill and completely unhinged. She pointed a manicured finger at the documents, her face distorted with blind panic and rage. She could feel her country club memberships, her luxury vehicles, and her unearned social status dissolving into dust. "She is making this all up. It is a bluff. You cannot just secretly buy our debt and pretend to be a billionaire." She whirled around to face Marcus, grabbing him roughly by the shoulder of his fleece vest. "Marcus, do something. You are the tech genius. Get your laptop out right now. Hack into these so-called offshore accounts and prove these documents are fake. Show Richard she is lying to us." Marcus did not move. He did not reach for his laptop. He sat entirely paralyzed, a thin layer of cold sweat coating his forehead. He stared at the documents on the table with an expression of pure, unadulterated horror. He knew exactly what those financial structures looked like, because they were the exact same structures that had funded and then instantly frozen his own $20 million venture capital fantasy just days prior. I slowly turned my head. I locked my cold, dead gaze directly onto Marcus. I slowly turned my head. I locked my cold, dead gaze directly onto Marcus. He looked as though all the blood had been drained from his veins. The arrogant tech visionary from Friday night was gone, replaced by a terrified little boy, realizing his entire identity was a complete illusion. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. I simply reached into the leather briefcase, held by my second litigator, and extracted a much thinner, sleek black folder. I tossed it across the polished mahogany table. It slid with a sharp scraping sound, coming to a dead stop exactly inches from Marcus's trembling hands. "Speaking of high-level tech connections," I said, my tone dripping with icy precision, Did you manage to figure out the exact identity of the silent investor who permanently froze your $20 million funding at 8 o'clock on Friday night, Marcus? You spent all weekend bragging about your incredible pitching skills. You told me they recognized your absolute genius within 5 minutes. Marcus stared at the black folder as if it were a live explosive. He reached out with shaking fingers and flipped open the heavy cardstock cover. His eyes darted wildly across the top page, reading the corporate letterhead, his breathing turning shallow and rapid. The shell company funding your highly unstable crypto startup is called Apex Ventures, I stated clearly, ensuring every single board member heard the exact details of his financial execution. Apex Ventures is a direct, fully owned subsidiary of Sterling Holdings. I personally approved your Series A funding 3 weeks ago because I wanted to see exactly how fragile your business model truly was. It took my analysts less than an hour to flag your entire operation as a highly leveraged house of cards. You did not secure that money because you are a tech visionary. You secured it because I allowed it. I stepped away from the chairman's seat and walked slowly down the length of the table, stopping directly across from him. You married into the Vanguard family because you were completely desperate for corporate funding, I continued. You treated me like absolute dirt for years because you genuinely thought I was beneath you. You kicked my financial portfolios across my bedroom floor. You stepped on my revenue projections. You called me a pathetic consultant playing business. Marcus swallowed hard, unable to formulate a single word of defense. Now let us look at the reality, I said, tapping the black folder. You violated the morality and conduct clause of your funding agreement by engaging in documented verbal abuse and destruction of private property. My security team logged the entire interaction. Your $20 million lifeline is completely dead. Furthermore, due to the aggressive breach of contract penalties you completely failed to read in your term sheet, you now owe Sterling Holdings $5 million in immediate damages. You are officially bankrupt, Marcus. Your assets will be seized before the banks even close today. A suffocating silence swallowed the boardroom. The reality of his absolute ruin crashed down upon Marcus with the weight of a collapsing skyscraper. He dropped the black folder onto the floor, his face contorted from paralyzing fear into blind, desperate rage. He did not look at me. He spun around and turned his furious gaze directly onto his wife. "This is your fault," Marcus screamed at Victoria, his voice cracking with unchecked hysteria. His sudden outburst made Richard jump in his seat, the older man watching his carefully controlled empire turn into a circus. "You and your toxic, arrogant family dragged me into this mess. You told me she was a nobody. You told me I could treat her however I wanted because she had zero power and no connections. You forced me to go up to that penthouse on Friday and kick her out." Victoria recoiled, her eyes wide with shock and outrage. Her pristine, highly manicured image was fracturing under the intense pressure of imminent poverty. "Do not you dare blame me for your catastrophic failures," she shrieked back, her hands gripping the edge of the table so hard her knuckles turned white. "You are a complete fraud, Marcus. You have been begging my father for capital since the day we got married. You ruined your own company with your sheer incompetence." The polished Vanguard facade was instantly shattering. The Golden family was violently cracking from the inside, rapidly turning on each other like starved animals cornered in a trap. They were stripping away years of fake smiles and society manners to reveal the selfish, greedy core that kept them together. "I am ruined because of your pathetic brother," Marcus yelled, pointing a shaking finger directly at Julian, completely ignoring his wife's screaming. "He is the one who abused her. He is the one who brought a billionaire heir into this family and treated her like garbage. I am not taking the fall for Vanguard's collapse. Richard, you need to fix this. You need to bail me out." Richard remained frozen, entirely unable to comprehend the sheer magnitude of the hostile takeover happening in his own boardroom. Julian's face twisted into a mask of pure, desperate panic. He could see his entire empire dissolving, his family turning on him, and the absolute reality of my power crushing his future. He frantically dug into his leather briefcase, his hands moving with clumsy, erratic haste. He pulled out the thick manila folder from Friday night, the very same documents Arthur Pendleton had ambushed me with in the hotel lobby. Julian slammed the heavy file down onto the mahogany table with a resounding thud. It does not matter, Julian yelled, his voice echoing with frantic, unhinged desperation. He pointed triumphantly at the signature lines on the top page, clinging to his last shred of leverage. None of this matters. You signed the absolute prenuptial waiver on Friday night, Maya. You signed the permanent divorce settlement in front of my lawyer. You explicitly waived every single right to any marital assets. You legally have absolutely no claim to my personal Vanguard shares or my private offshore accounts. I am completely shielded. My lead litigator, the striking woman in the pristine white suit, looked down at the divorce papers Julian had just violently slammed onto the table. She did not flinch. She did not argue. Instead, she did something that entirely shattered the remaining tension in the room. She threw her head back and laughed out loud. It was a sharp, piercing sound of genuine, unfiltered amusement that echoed brightly off the panoramic glass walls of the boardroom. Julian flinched as if she had physically struck him across the face. His arrogant posture instantly evaporated, replaced by a deep, terrifying uncertainty. He looked from the litigator to me, his jaw working uselessly as he tried to comprehend why the woman he was threatening was currently treating him like an absolute joke. I leaned back in the oversized leather chairman seat and slowly steepled my fingers together. I kept my gaze locked dead onto his panicked, sweating face. "Oh, Julian," I said, my voice dropping to a soft, lethal whisper that carried to every single corner of the silent room. "You were in such an unbelievable rush to leave me with absolutely nothing that you did not even let your own lawyers read the fine print." Arthur Pendleton, the Vanguard corporate attorney, standing helplessly in the corner of the room, suddenly went entirely rigid. He lunged toward the mahogany table, grabbing the divorce decree Julian had just thrown down. His eyes began frantically scanning the legal jargon he had hastily prepared and forced me to sign on Friday night. I watched Arthur's face turn the color of wet ash as the fatal realization finally hit him. "Let me explain exactly how corporate liability works when you are blindingly arrogant," I continued, my voice slicing through the heavy, stale air of the boardroom. "When you forced me to sign away all marital assets in that lobby, you also explicitly forced me to sign away any and all marital liabilities. You demanded full unilateral ownership of every single bank account, every single property, and every single shell company registered under your name. You wanted it all so you could throw me out into the street. And legally, your brilliant attorney gave it all to you." Arthur dropped the papers onto the floor. He looked at Richard with an expression of pure, unadulterated terror, slowly shaking his head. "By severing our financial ties so aggressively, you legally absorbed 100% of the hidden toxic debt you had secretly accrued," I stated, enunciating every single word, so it would permanently embed itself in his skull. "I am now completely legally insulated from your catastrophic financial ruin. You severed our financial ties, Julian, meaning Sterling. Holdings can now sue you personally. We can sue you for the $40 million you explicitly embezzled from Vanguard Real Estate without me taking a single financial hit." Julian stumbled backward, his knees hitting the edge of a leather chair. "Embezzled," he choked out, his voice cracking wildly. "I never embezzled anything. I am the future CEO of this company. I made investments. You cannot prove anything." I did not argue with his pathetic, desperate denial. I simply reached into my briefcase, pulled out a thick, glossy black folder, and slid it forcefully across the massive mahogany table. It glided perfectly, stopping right in front of Richard and Julian. "Open it," I commanded. Richard reached out with trembling hands and flipped the cover open. A dozen high-resolution, aggressively detailed photographs spilled out onto the polished wood. They were crystal-clear, date-stamped surveillance images that left absolutely zero room for interpretation. They showed Julian standing on the teak deck of a massive multi-million-dollar luxury yacht docked in Miami. They showed him signing the deed to a $15 million waterfront condominium. And in every single photograph, clinging tightly to his arm and wearing the historic Vanguard family diamonds that belonged in a bank vault, was his 22-year-old mistress. "You told the board you were allocating those corporate funds for a highly lucrative commercial expansion in South Beach," I explained, watching Richard's face turn a sickening shade of gray as he stared at the photographs of his son. But you did not buy commercial real estate, Julian. You bought a yacht. You bought a penthouse for a woman barely out of college, and you paid for it all using Vanguard corporate funds. The exact same corporate funds that Sterling Holdings had secretly loaned this company to keep you from going bankrupt. Victoria let out a shrill, horrified gasp, covering her mouth with her manicured hands as she looked at the photographs of her brother's mistress. Marcus stared at the table, completely broken, realizing his brother-in-law was infinitely more corrupt and incompetent than he was. "That is federal wire fraud," I stated calmly, folding my hands on the table. "That is massive, undeniable corporate embezzlement. You stole $40 million of my money to fund your pathetic infidelity. You used a corporate account to hide your cheating from me. And now that you explicitly claimed sole ownership of those specific accounts in our divorce decree, you have legally confessed to the entire crime. There is no shared marital blame. There is no Vanguard corporate shield. You own the fraud, Julian, 100%. Julian looked like a man standing on the gallows with the lever about to drop. He backed away from the table, his chest heaving, his eyes darting toward the heavy oak doors, as if calculating his chances of escaping the building before the federal authorities arrived. He was completely trapped in a cage of his own making, locked permanently inside by his own blind greed and staggering arrogance. Richard let out a horrible, ragged wheeze. He dropped the glossy photographs and aggressively grabbed his chest, his fingers digging deeply into his expensive silk tie. The mighty patriarch of the Vanguard Empire was watching his entire legacy, his family name, and his entire fortune vaporize right in front of his eyes. If Sterling Holdings went public with the embezzlement and the fraud, Vanguard would be liquidated by the end of the week. Julian would face decades in a federal penitentiary. The scandal would completely eradicate the family from high society forever. "Maya, please," Richard begged, his voice reduced to a pathetic, trembling whisper. The arrogant disdain he had always shown me was completely eradicated, replaced by absolute visceral terror. He leaned heavily on the mahogany table, looking at me with wide, desperate eyes, his pride entirely broken. "We can fix this. You do not have to involve the authorities. Keep this in the family. We can restructure the debt. I will step down immediately. I will hand you the keys to the entire kingdom. I will make you the sole CEO of Vanguard Real Estate today. Just please do not destroy us." I looked at the man who had treated me like garbage for 5 years, watching him practically beg on his knees to the woman he had called a nobody just minutes prior. I opened my mouth to deliver my final crushing verdict. Before I could speak a single syllable, the heavy oak doors of the boardroom swung open with a deafening, violent crash. The heavy oak doors did not simply open. They were violently thrust apart by 2 towering security personnel slamming backward against the frosted glass walls with a force that rattled the crystal water pitchers resting on the mahogany table. The air pressure in the room seemed to instantly plummet, sucking the breath directly out of everyone's lungs. Victor Sterling stepped over the threshold. He was not just a billionaire. He was a living, breathing Wall Street titan, a legendary corporate predator whose mere name was enough to bankrupt rival firms or elevate obscure startups into global monopolies overnight. He wore a charcoal bespoke suit that commanded absolute terrifying authority. Every step he took toward the center of the room was deliberate, heavy, and completely silent. He did not glance at the frantic accountants shrinking against the walls. He ignored Victoria, who was now openly weeping into her shaking hands. He did not spare a single look for Marcus, who was hyperventilating in his chair. The suffocating weight of my father's presence pressed down on the Vanguard executives like a physical, inescapable gravity. Richard Vanguard, a man who had spent his entire adult life projecting a flawless aura of untouchable elite wealth, instantly withered. All the arrogant color drained completely from his face, leaving his skin a mottled, sickly gray. He scrambled to his feet, his heavy leather chair scraping loudly and awkwardly against the polished floor. His knees actually knocked against the table edge. He was trembling so violently that his expensive gold cufflinks vibrated against his chest. Victor Richard choked out, forcing his shaking hand forward in a pathetic, desperate gesture of greeting. "Mr. Sterling, I had absolutely no idea you were coming to this meeting. We can handle this situation internally. There is no need for hostiles. My father did not acknowledge Richard's existence. He walked straight past the extended hand, leaving the mighty patriarch of the Vanguard Empire standing there like an invisible, incompetent servant. Victor Sterling kept his piercing eyes locked entirely on me. The entire boardroom held its collective breath. The silence was absolute, heavy, and deafening, broken only by the faint, panicked wheezing coming from Julian's side of the table. My father stopped right next to my chair. He reached down and gently cupped my chin. His large, powerful hand was surprisingly tender, as his thumb brushed lightly across the faint, fading purple bruise along my left cheekbone. It was the exact spot where Julian had violently backhanded me during the Vanguard charity gala just 2 nights ago, the specific assault that had triggered this entire corporate execution. I looked up into my father's eyes, seeing the quiet, burning inferno of a parent pushed beyond the absolute limit. He traced the edge of the bruise one final time before lowering his hand. My father slowly turned his head to look at the man sitting across from me. Julian physically recoiled, pressing his spine so hard into the back of his chair that the leather groaned under the pressure. Julian looked like a cornered animal, realizing the trap had just snapped entirely shut. "You struck my daughter," my father said. His voice was not a shout. It was a low, seismic rumble that vibrated ominously through the floorboards. "You struck my daughter in front of 600 people." My father continued, his tone methodical and dripping with lethal intent. "You publicly humiliated her. You threw her out into the freezing rain because you genuinely thought she was a nobody. You looked at the woman who spent years trying to fix your pathetic, failing life, and you decided she was worthless." My father leaned forward, placing his palms flat on the mahogany table, trapping Julian in his unyielding gaze. Julian opened his mouth, his lips trembling, but only a wet, pathetic choking sound emerged from his throat. He was entirely paralyzed by fear. "You thought she had no one to protect her?" My father stated, every syllable landing like a hammer blow. "You thought you were completely untouchable because your last name was Vanguard. You thought your father's mediocre real estate firm made you a king. Today, I am going to erase the Vanguard bloodline from the financial sector forever. I am going to systematically dismantle your family legacy, liquidate every single one of your hidden assets, and ensure that your name becomes a pathetic cautionary tale whispered in business schools for the next century. You will not have a dime left to buy a cup of coffee when I am finished with you." Richard let out a desperate, guttural cry. The realization that his son's arrogant cruelty had doomed their entire family empire finally shattered his remaining pride. He lunged forward, slamming both hands onto the table, his chest heaving with panic. "Victor! Wait!" Richard begged, his voice cracking wildly. "You cannot do this. We have history. 20 years ago we made a pact. Remember the Atlantic Harbor development in Miami? We shook hands on it. I stepped back so your holding company could acquire the marina. I gave you that entire coastal territory without a bidding war. You owe me a professional courtesy." Richard clawed at his chest, his breathing turning incredibly ragged as the stress overwhelmed his heart. "Keep this in the family, Victor. Spare my son. Spare the Vanguard name. I will step down immediately. I will hand Maya the keys to the entire kingdom. I will make her the sole CEO of Vanguard Real Estate today. Just please, I am begging you, do not destroy us over a mistake." My father slowly stood up straight, smoothing the lapels of his suit jacket. The faint trace of humanity left his face entirely. His eyes turned completely lethal cold and utterly void of mercy. He looked at Richard, not as a peer, but as a minor pest that needed to be permanently exterminated. He did not speak a single word of acknowledgement to Richard. Instead, my father raised his right hand and gave a sharp, subtle flick of his wrist toward his lead counsel standing silently by the entrance. "Bring out the black file," my father commanded. The lead litigator stepped forward with swift, terrifying efficiency. She did not carry a standard legal binder. Instead, she retrieved a sleek, heavily reinforced carbon fiber lockbox from the floor and placed it directly in front of my father. The metallic click of the latch echoing in the dead silence of the boardroom sounded like the cocking of a loaded weapon. My father flipped the lid open. He reached inside and pulled out a weathered, severely aged manila dossier. The edges of the paper were yellowed, a stark contrast to the crisp, freshly printed financial executions scattered across the rest of the table. He did not look at the documents. He kept his lethal, unyielding gaze locked entirely on Richard Vanguard. "A favor," my father repeated. His voice was a low, guttural rasp that seemed to lower the temperature of the entire room. "You stand in my presence drowning in your own incompetence, and you dare to invoke the word favor. You claim you stepped back from the Atlantic Harbor development 20 years ago as a professional courtesy." Richard swallowed audibly. His throat bobbed up and down, but no words came out. He was gripping the edge of the mahogany table so desperately that his fingernails were turning purple. "Let us correct the historical record for everyone present," my father stated, tossing the yellowed dossier onto the table. It slid open, revealing incredibly complex architectural schematics, original financial blueprints, and pages of ancient dot matrix digital server logs. 20 years ago, you did not step back from anything, Richard. You infiltrated Sterling Holdings' private servers. You actively stole the proprietary algorithms and the complete developmental blueprints for the Atlantic Harbor project. You committed corporate espionage on a massive scale. That stolen intellectual property was the entire foundation of Vanguard Real Estate. You did not build an empire, you built a pathetic monument to your own thievery. A collective gasp rippled through the room. Victoria let out a muffled whimper, her manicured hands flying to cover her mouth. Marcus stared at his father-in-law with pure, unfiltered disgust. The grand patriarch of the Vanguard family was not a brilliant self-made man. He was a common thief who had spent 2 decades pretending to be a king. "You actually thought you got away with it?" My father continued, his tone methodical and devoid of any human warmth. "You thought Victor Sterling simply missed the data breach. But I do not overlook theft, Richard, and I certainly do not forgive. I simply calculate the absolute optimal time to strike. I decided that suing a fledgling startup was beneath me. I wanted you to build your little paper castle. I wanted you to inflate your fragile ego. I waited exactly 20 years for you to build this company into something you loved, just so I could take it away when it would hurt you the most." My father leaned closer, his shadow falling completely over Richard's trembling form. "I let you think you were a titan. And then when your idiot son brought my brilliant daughter into your toxic household, I simply sat back and let her deliver the final fatal blow from the inside." Richard collapsed back into his chair. His chest heaved erratically. He looked like a man whose very soul had been violently ripped from his body. The legacy he had sacrificed everything to protect was a complete lie exposed in front of his family, his board and his highest-ranking executives. There was no dignity left. There was only the cold, hard floor of reality rushing up to meet him. My father closed the weathered dossier. He stood up straight, turning his back on Richard as if the man had already ceased to exist. The ruthless Wall Street predator vanished, and as he looked down at me, his expression softened into one of absolute unwavering pride. He stepped back from the head of the table, offering me the floor. "The board is yours, Madam CEO," my father said quietly. "Execute them." I stood up. The transition was instantaneous. I was no longer the abused, dismissed charity case Julian had brought home. I was no longer the quiet consultant who smiled through Victoria's insults or Marcus's condescension. I was the chief executive officer of Sterling Holdings, and I was holding the absolute power of life and death over their entire existence. I did not yell. I did not raise my voice. I spoke with a terrifying absolute calm that commanded total submission. "I am calling in Vanguard's debt," I announced, my voice slicing through the boardroom like a scalpel. Effective immediately, Vanguard Real Estate is an absolute default. All corporate assets are permanently seized. This includes the corporate headquarters we are currently standing in. It includes the fleet of company vehicles parked in the underground garage. It includes your corporate credit cards, your expense accounts, and your private country club memberships funded by this firm. As of this exact second, your access to liquid capital is 0. The absolute finality of my words crashed down on them. Victoria began sobbing openly, the harsh, ugly sounds of a woman losing her entire identity. Julian suddenly slammed his fists onto the table. his face turning a blotchy, furious red. "You cannot do this!" he screamed, spittle flying from his lips as he grasped blindly for any remaining lifeline. "Corporate law mandates a 30-day grace period for debt restructuring. My lawyers know this. You have to give us formal notice. We have 30 days to pay you back. We have a month to find new investors." I looked at my ex-husband. I stood perfectly still, letting his frantic, pathetic shouting echo off the glass walls. Then, with deliberate, agonizing slowness, I raised my left arm and tapped the crystal face of my designer watch. "Normally, under standard operating procedures, you would be absolutely correct, Julian," I replied, my voice dropping to a deadly whisper. "But you did not just default on a loan. You embezzled the funds. You committed federal wire fraud, using the exact capital Sterling Holdings provided to this firm." I gestured toward the photographs of his yacht and his mistress still scattered across the mahogany table. "Criminal misuse of corporate funds explicitly nullifies any and all grace periods," I explained, watching the last flicker of hope die in his eyes. "That triggers the immediate acceleration clause in your contract. There is no 30-day window. There are no new investors. You have exactly until 5 o'clock this evening to pack whatever fits in a single cardboard box and vacate my premises." The sheer gravity of my eviction order finally broke whatever fragile psychological dam was holding the Vanguard family together. The silence did not last. It was violently shattered by Marcus. He shot up from his chair with such chaotic force that the heavy leather seat tipped over backward and crashed loudly against the floor-to-ceiling windows. He whipped his head toward Victoria, his face contorted into a mask of absolute, unhinged loathing. "You are broke!" Marcus screamed, the veins in his neck bulging aggressively against his designer fleece collar. "You are completely, entirely penniless. Your father is a corporate fraud, your brother is a felon, and your entire trust fund is a mirage." Victoria recoiled, thick streams of black mascara running down her perfectly contoured face. She reached out her heavily jeweled hands, shaking. "Marcus, stop it. We are a team. We can fight this together." "A team," he barked, letting out a sharp, venomous laugh that echoed harshly across the glass room. "I married you for the Vanguard capital. I endured your insufferable country club friends, your endless shopping sprees, and your completely vacuous personality solely because you were supposed to fund my company. You are a useless liability. I am filing for divorce the exact second I leave this building." Victoria's sorrow instantly transmuted into blinding, explosive rage. She lunged forward with terrifying speed. Her hand arced through the air and she slapped Marcus across the face with everything she had. The sharp, brutal crack of her palm against his jaw sounded like a snapping tree branch. Marcus staggered backward, clutching his rapidly reddening cheek. "You psychotic leech," he spat, pointing a trembling finger at her face. "You have nothing. You are nothing." They stood mere inches apart, screaming vicious, deeply personal insults, physically tearing apart their hollow, status-obsessed marriage right in front of the board of directors. The polished elite illusion of their high society life burned to absolute ash in a matter of seconds. Julian did not intervene to help his sister. He did not even look at his father, who was still slumped sideways in his chair, clutching his chest and wheezing pathetically. Julian was entirely consumed by his own impending destruction. He stared at me with wide, bloodshot eyes. His arrogant, untouchable swagger was entirely gone. His legs simply gave out beneath him. He fell hard onto his knees, hitting the custom-woven carpet with a dull thud. He crawled forward, closing the distance between us, his hands reaching out desperately toward the hem of my pristine white suit. I took a sharp, calculated step backward, looking down at him with undisguised repulsion. "Maya, please," Julian sobbed, his voice cracking into a pathetic, high-pitched whine. "You cannot do this. You cannot just erase us. Think about us. Think about our history." He looked up at me, heavy tears and cold sweat mingling on his pale face, attempting to weaponize the very past he had so easily discarded. "We met in college. Remember the tiny freezing apartment we rented in Cambridge before Vanguard took off? Remember our golden retriever Max? We built a life together from nothing. 10 years, Maya. We have 10 years of marriage. He was fully hyperventilating, now his chest heaving violently as he grasped at anything that might trigger a shred of my empathy. It was the stress. You know exactly how Richard is. Vanguard was bleeding money and my father was breathing down my neck every single day to fix it. I was drowning. The yacht, the offshore accounts, the girl. The mistress meant absolutely nothing. She was just a distraction from the crushing pressure, a stupid, meaningless mistake. I love you, Maya. I have always loved you. Please just give me one chance to make it right. I stood perfectly still, looking down at a man I once thought I knew. He was not crying out of genuine remorse. He was crying because he had finally been caught. He was a cornered predator frantically trying to play the victim, begging on his hands and knees for scraps of the empire he had tried to steal from me. I did not answer his desperate pleas. I simply raised my right hand and signaled my lead litigator. She immediately stepped forward and tapped a button on her silver presentation remote. The massive frosted glass wall at the far end of the boardroom instantly darkened. Hidden ceiling projectors whirred to life, transforming the entire surface into a state-of-the-art high-definition screen. The video began to play. It was completely silent, which only made the visual impact infinitely more terrifying. It was high-resolution, multi-angle security footage retrieved directly from the luxury hotel that hosted the Vanguard Charity Gala just 2 nights prior. The footage clearly showed Julian violently cornering me in the secluded marble corridor. It captured the aggressive, threatening way he backed me against the wall, towering over me while shouting. And then in agonizing, unavoidable detail, the video showed him raising his right arm. It showed him brutally slapping me across the face with so much force that my head snapped to the side and my shoulder crashed heavily into the decorative molding. The boardroom went dead silent again. Even Marcus and Victoria stopped screaming to watch the undeniable proof of Julian's brutality playing on a massive 10-foot loop. That footage, I stated, my voice echoing through the silent room, entirely devoid of a single ounce of empathy or hesitation, was forwarded at exactly 9 o'clock this morning to the Securities and Exchange Commission, the Boston Police Department, and the editorial desks of every major financial news network on the Eastern Seaboard. Julian remained frozen on his knees. He stared blankly at the massive screen, his mouth opening and closing in rapid, silent succession. He slowly turned his head back to look at me, his hands shaking so violently they were practically vibrating against the carpet. The full, crushing weight of federal prison and absolute public execution finally settled squarely onto his shoulders. I leaned forward slightly, making sure my cold, unyielding gaze was the very last thing he focused on before his entire world collapsed. "You didn't slap a loving wife, Julian," I said softly. "You assaulted your primary creditor, and I don't forgive debts." Julian remained completely frozen on the custom-woven carpet. His jaw worked uselessly as the absolute finality of my words crushed the last remaining breath from his lungs. His hand, still reaching out toward the hem of my white suit, fell limply to his sides. He had nothing left to say. There were no more lies to spin. I broke eye contact with my ex-husband and turned my attention to the men in the dark charcoal suits flanking the boardroom doors. "Lock the building down," I ordered. My voice was sharp, absolute, and completely stripped of any lingering hesitation. My security team moved with terrifying, synchronized military precision. They fanned out across the massive room, systematically pulling power cords from presentation servers, snapping corporate laptops shut, and physically removing cell phones directly from the hands of the paralyzed Vanguard executives. The lead litigator stepped forward, sliding thick, aggressively stamped asset seizure documentation across the mahogany table. She pinned the heavy stacks down with silver pens, legally sealing the fate of the entire company. I walked slowly around the edge of the table, my heels clicking methodically against the polished hardwood border. The sound echoed like a metronome counting down their final seconds of relevance. I stopped directly behind the oversized leather chair where Victoria was currently hyperventilating. I reached into the sleek carbon fiber lockbox my litigator had brought and extracted a crisp, heavy linen envelope. I dropped it unceremoniously onto the table right in front of Victoria's manicured, shaking hands. She stared at the pristine white paper as if it were a venomous snake preparing to strike. She looked up at me, her face heavily streaked with ruined mascara, and slowly reached for the flap. She pulled out the legal document. Her eyes darted frantically back and forth across the aggressive black text. A fresh, blinding wave of sheer terror washed over her features. "That is a formal, legally binding eviction notice," I stated, ensuring my voice carried to every single corner of the silent boardroom. "You and Marcus have been parading around Boston in a $10 million luxury townhouse, pretending you bought it with cash. You loved bragging about it at your elite country club luncheons. But you did not pay cash. You heavily mortgaged the property using Vanguard corporate stock as your primary collateral." Marcus choked on a breath, his eyes darting frantically toward the heavy oak exit doors as the fatal realization dawned on him. 3 months ago, a private subsidiary of Sterling Holdings quietly purchased that specific debt portfolio, I explained. I leaned down just enough so Victoria could hear the absolute lethal finality in my tone. "Because your brother just bankrupted this entire firm by embezzling corporate funds, your Vanguard collateral is now mathematically worthless. You are in severe immediate default. You do not own a single square inch of that townhouse, Victoria. I do. And you have exactly 2 hours to get your designer luggage off my property before I have the locks permanently changed," Victoria snapped. The fragile, carefully constructed illusion of her elite high society existence shattered into a million jagged pieces. She leaped up from her chair, her face contorting into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. She crumpled the eviction notice in her fist and hurled it violently at my chest. The heavy paper bounced harmlessly off my white suit lapel and fluttered down to the floor. "You cannot do this to me!" Victoria shrieked. Her voice hit a pitch so high and hysterical that it actually vibrated against the glass walls. "I am a Vanguard. I am high society. I was born into generational wealth, you pathetic lying nobody." She slammed her palms onto the mahogany table, knocking over a crystal water pitcher. The water spilled everywhere, soaking directly into her father's useless legal decrees, ruining the ink. "You are a fake heiress!" she screamed, spittle flying from her trembling lips as she completely lost her mind. "You came into my house pretending to be trash. You tricked us. You manipulated my brother. You will not bully me. I am not leaving this building. I am not leaving my townhouse. You are nothing but a sociopathic fraud." She crossed her arms tightly over her chest, stomping her expensive designer heel into the floor like a petulant, spoiled toddler throwing a massive tantrum. She genuinely believed her last name still carried weight. She genuinely believed she could simply refuse to accept the reality of her total, absolute destruction. Marcus did not stand beside her. He frantically backed away from his wife, his hands raised in cowardly surrender, actively trying to distance himself from the toxic meltdown. He looked at my security team, entirely terrified that he would be caught in the crossfire of her psychotic break. I did not raise my voice. I did not blink. I simply stared at her, watching a 30-year-old woman absolutely disintegrate. The silence in the room stretched out, highlighting the pathetic hollow echo of her screaming. I raised my right hand and snapped my fingers. It was a single sharp, commanding crack. The 2 towering security guards who had kicked open the boardroom doors moved instantly. They crossed the room in 3 massive strides, entirely ignoring her frantic, useless protests. Before Victoria could even register their proximity, they flanked her. Each man grabbed one of her arms with an unyielding iron grip. "Get your hands off me!" Victoria shrieked, kicking her legs wildly in the air. "Do you know who I am? I will have you fired. I will have you arrested." The guards did not speak a single word. They did not hesitate. They simply lifted her. Her feet literally left the carpet. They hoisted her up by her armpits and marched her directly toward the double doors. She thrashed violently, her designer heels flying off and clattering loudly against the glass walls. She fought like a wild animal, her shrieks echoing down the long corporate hallway as they physically dragged the screaming heiress out of the executive suite. Marcus stood frozen in place for exactly 2 seconds. He looked at me, his face completely pale and slick with cold sweat. Then he turned and sprinted out the door after her, completely abandoning the Vanguard Empire to save his own miserable skin. He did not look back. He ran like a coward fleeing a burning building. The heavy oak doors swung shut, cutting off the last faint echoes of Victoria's hysterical screaming. The boardroom settled into a heavy, suffocating silence. The remaining executive team stood pinned against the walls, completely paralyzed, realizing that the Sterling Holdings takeover was absolute and irreversible. There was no negotiation. There was only total surrender. Richard remained slumped in his chair, a broken, defeated shell of a man, staring blankly at the stolen blueprints that had just destroyed his entire life's work. I slowly turned my attention back to Julian. He was exactly where I had left him, kneeling on the carpet, entirely stripped of his pride, his stolen money, and his future. He was not looking at me anymore. He was staring past me, his gaze fixed on the panoramic floor-to-ceiling glass windows that overlooked the bustling Boston street far below. His eyes were wide, completely devoid of hope. His jaw trembled violently. I turned my head and followed his line of sight. Through the massive glass panes, the gray afternoon sky was violently illuminated by a rapid, aggressive strobe of flashing red and blue lights. The brilliant, alternating colors bounced off the boardroom walls, casting harsh, unforgiving shadows across Julian's terrified face. A line of 6 marked police cruisers, flanked tightly by 2 unmarked federal black SUVs, aggressively jumped the curb and completely surrounded the front entrance of the Vanguard real estate building. Heavily armed officers were already spilling out of the vehicles, moving with urgent tactical precision toward the revolving glass doors. Julian looked up at me, his breathing incredibly shallow and rapid. He realized the embezzlement was no longer just a corporate threat. It was a criminal reality. The authorities had arrived. The heavy oak doors of the boardroom swung open for the third and final time. There was no knock, no polite request for entry from a nervous receptionist, and absolutely no respect given to the supposed sanctity of the Vanguard corporate headquarters. 4 Boston police officers in full tactical uniform marched directly into the executive suite. They were immediately flanked by 2 men wearing the unmistakable razor-sharp navy suits of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. They moved with the calculated, heavy, synchronized rhythm of a specialized strike team executing a high-value target. The static crackle of their shoulder radios sliced through the dead silence of the room, a harsh mechanical sound that completely shattered the illusion of elite, untouchable wealth Vanguard had spent decades cultivating. The remaining Vanguard executives and board members practically threw themselves against the frosted glass walls, desperately trying to physically distance themselves from the center of the room. Julian Vanguard. The lead federal agent spoke. His voice was entirely devoid of emotion, ringing out with absolute clinical authority. He stepped forward and flashed a gold shield that caught the glare of the overhead boardroom lights. "You are under arrest." The agent did not give Julian the dignity of standing up on his own. He signaled with a sharp tilt of his chin, and 2 uniformed officers advanced. They grabbed Julian by the shoulders of his obscenely expensive tailored suit and roughly hauled him to his feet. Julian offered absolutely zero physical resistance. His legs were entirely useless. He hung between the 2 towering officers like a rag doll, a pathetic, crumbling mannequin stripped of every single ounce of the arrogant swagger he had weaponized for his entire life. The harsh metallic ratcheting of steel handcuffs echoing in the pristine corporate sanctuary was the loudest sound in the world. It was a brutal mechanical clicking that signaled the absolute end of his freedom. "Julian Vanguard, you are being taken into federal custody." The lead agent continued, reading from a document pulled from his breast pocket. "You are being formally charged with multiple counts of wire fraud, massive corporate embezzlement, and aggravated domestic battery. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." Julian was forcefully spun around to face the doors. In doing so, he was forced to lock eyes with the dozens of Vanguard employees, senior staff, and board members who had rushed to the glass corridor walls to witness the commotion. These were the exact same people Julian had routinely terrorized for years. These were the assistants he had screamed at for bringing him the wrong coffee, the junior executives he had publicly humiliated to inflate his own ego, and the vice presidents he had threatened to fire on a daily basis. Now they were all watching him weep openly. They were watching the untouchable golden boy of the Vanguard Empire standing with his wrists bound tightly behind his back, his face a wet, swollen mess of terror and snot. The schadenfreude radiating from the staff outside the glass was palpable. It was the ultimate, inescapable public execution of his character, and he was being forced to look every single one of his victims in the eye as he fell. Julian twisted his neck wildly, his chest heaving with frantic, shallow breaths. His panicked eyes darted around the mahogany table until they finally locked onto the man still slumped in the chairman's seat. "Dad!" Julian shrieked. His voice was completely raw, cracking into a high-pitched guttural wail of sheer desperation. "Dad, please. Call Arthur. Call the entire legal team. Tell them to fix this right now. You cannot let them take me out there. The press is downstairs. There are cameras everywhere. Dad, you have to do something. Please, Dad." Richard Vanguard stood perfectly still. He looked at his son, his own flesh and blood, begging for salvation in federal handcuffs. Then Richard slowly shifted his gaze toward the two FBI agents who were now staring directly at him. Their expressions were cold, assessing, and highly observant. Richard understood the stakes instantly. He knew exactly what was happening. If he defended his son, if he aligned himself in any way with Julian's actions, the FBI would immediately freeze his personal accounts, drag him into the interrogation room, and likely attach him to the exact same federal indictment. Richard took a slow, deliberate step backward. He literally put physical distance between himself and his crying son. He cleared his throat, raising his chin and projecting his voice so every single federal agent, board member, and employee could hear him with crystal clarity. "I have absolutely no knowledge of these crimes," Richard announced. His voice was completely devoid of any paternal warmth or hesitation. Vanguard Real Estate officially and completely distances itself from these rogue illegal actions. You abused your position, Julian. You acted entirely alone. You brought this upon yourself, and you will face the consequences without the protection of this firm. Julian's mouth fell open, his jaw unhinging as the ultimate betrayal washed over him. The father who had taught him every toxic, arrogant, selfish trait he possessed had just thrown him entirely to the wolves to save his own skin. He had been completely discarded by the only person he thought would always protect him. Julian let out a guttural, agonizing scream of pure despair as the officers forcefully shoved him forward, marching him out of the boardroom and toward the elevators to face the flashing cameras and the national news networks waiting eagerly on the street below. My father, Victor, watched the entire display with icy, predatory satisfaction. He turned his head and gave a single sharp nod to my lead litigator. "Continue the asset seizure," my father commanded smoothly. "Liquidate every single remaining account." Richard whipped his head around. He suddenly realized that publicly sacrificing his only son had not saved his company. The Sterling Holdings execution was still moving forward with lethal efficiency. The lawyers were already sliding the final default papers toward me for my signature. Richard's eyes darted wildly around the room, searching for an exit that did not exist. He suddenly gasped loudly. He grabbed the left side of his chest with both hands, his fingers digging frantically into his silk tie. He let out a strangled, theatrical wheeze, his knees intentionally buckling, as he collapsed heavily onto the mahogany floor. He writhed on the carpet, gasping aggressively for air, and clutching his heart, playing his absolute final desperate card to halt the corporate takeover by staging a massive medical emergency. Richard's chest heaved with exaggerated theatrical gasps. He clutched the fabric of his custom-tailored suit, twisting the expensive silk tie around his neck as if it were violently suffocating him. He rolled onto his side, knocking his heavy leather chair backward with a loud, echoing crash. "Call an ambulance," he wheezed, his voice straining for a gravelly, desperate pitch. "Medical emergency. I am invoking immediate medical incapacity. No corporate transfers can be legally executed. The Sterling Holdings seizure is temporarily suspended by law. Call the paramedics right now." He flopped onto his back, staring blindly at the ceiling, his hands shaking violently. He was practically reciting the corporate bylaws between his fake ragged breaths. He knew exactly what he was doing. If a primary signatory was medically compromised during a hostile takeover, the paperwork would be stalled in emergency injunctions for weeks. It was a pathetic, cowardly delay tactic from a man who had absolutely zero leverage left. Before anyone in the room could even react to his pathetic performance, a sudden commotion erupted in the hallway. The heavy oak doors burst open once again. Victoria shoved her way past a distracted police officer. She had managed to break free from the lobby guards the second she saw the flashing police lights outside. Her hair was completely unkempt, her expensive dress twisted, and her bare feet slapped harshly against the hardwood floor. She skidded to a halt, her eyes locking onto her father writhing on the custom-woven carpet. "Dad," she screamed, her voice tearing through the boardroom like a siren. She threw herself onto the floor beside him, wrapping her arms protectively around his shoulders. She whipped her head around to glare at me, her face a mask of absolute unhinged hatred. "You are killing him!" Victoria shrieked, pointing a shaking finger directly at my face. "You are literally murdering my father right in front of everyone. Call an ambulance. Somebody do something. She is a murderer. She planned this to kill him and steal our company." The FBI agents exchanged tired, exasperated glances. The remaining Vanguard executives muttered nervously, a few of them instinctively reaching for their pockets before remembering my security team had already confiscated their phones. I did not flinch. I did not move to help him. I simply stood at the head of the mahogany table, looking down at the two of them wallowing on the floor. I had spent months anticipating every single one of Richard Vanguard's dirty corporate tricks. I knew he would try to exploit any possible loophole to delay the inevitable. I turned my head slightly and looked toward the back corner of the room. "Dr. Eris," I said softly, "if you would please." A tall, broad-shouldered man wearing a pristine charcoal suit stepped away from the frosted glass wall. He carried a sleek black leather medical bag. Dr. Eris was not just a physician. He was the chief of cardiology at Massachusetts General Hospital, and he was currently on a highly lucrative exclusive retainer for Sterling Holdings. I had brought him along specifically for this exact scenario. He walked briskly across the boardroom, his face a mask of absolute clinical detachment. He did not acknowledge Victoria's hysterical screaming. He simply knelt beside Richard on the carpet, opened his black leather bag, and pulled out a digital stethoscope and a pen light. "Get away from him," Victoria yelled, trying to swat the doctor's hands away. "We need real paramedics. We need an ambulance." Dr. Iris ignored her completely. He leaned over Richard, who was still gasping aggressively and clutching his left arm. The doctor pressed two fingers firmly against the side of Richard's neck, checking his carotid pulse. He then placed the stethoscope directly against Richard's chest, listening intently for several long, agonizing seconds. Richard squeezed his eyes shut tightly, groaning loudly in a desperate attempt to validate his performance. Dr. Eris pulled back. He reached into his pocket, retrieved a small medical penlight, and clicked it on. He pried Richard's eyelids open one by one, shining the bright, piercing beam directly into his pupils. He checked the capillary refill on Richard's fingertips, assessed his skin temperature, and finally rocked back on his heels. He packed his instruments away with agonizing slowness, snapping the leather bag shut with a sharp, definitive click. He stood up and turned to face the room, looking directly at the lead FBI agent. "The patient's heart rate is slightly elevated due to acute situational stress," Dr. Eris announced. His voice was loud, authoritative, and completely devoid of any sympathy. "However, his rhythm is perfectly steady, his pulse is strong. There is absolutely no diaphoresis, no cyanosis, and no erratic pupil dilation. He is experiencing zero signs of a myocardial infarction or any other cardiovascular event." The doctor looked down at Richard, his expression radiating pure, unfiltered professional disgust. "It is a theatrical panic attack," Dr. Aris stated flatly. "He is completely physically stable. He is perfectly fit to sign legal documents, and he is perfectly fit to be questioned by federal authorities. There is no medical incapacity." The silence that followed was suffocating. Victoria stopped screaming instantly. She sat frozen on the floor, her hands hovering uselessly in the air, her mouth hanging open as the doctor scientifically dismantled their last line of defense. Richard's fake, ragged gasping stopped immediately. He opened his eyes, realizing his pathetic charade had failed spectacularly. The humiliation was absolute. He had thrown himself on the floor, faked a deadly medical emergency in front of his entire executive board, his daughter, and the federal government, only to be clinically exposed as a desperate fraud by a top-tier cardiologist. One of the Boston police officers actually let out a short, mocking chuckle. The lead FBI agent shook his head in profound disgust, crossing his arms over his chest. "Get up, Mr. Vanguard," the agent ordered sharply. "You are embarrassing yourself. We have questions for you regarding your son's embezzlement." Richard had to physically pick himself off the floor. His face burned with a deep, humiliating crimson flush. He avoided looking at anyone. He brushed the lint off his expensive suit, his hands trembling with genuine shame, completely stripped of his untouchable corporate armor. He was nothing but an old, corrupt man who had just been caught throwing a tantrum on the carpet. I reached for the Sterling Holdings seizure documents, ready to finalize the absolute destruction of his legacy. But before my hand even brushed the thick paper, a sharp, piercing digital chime echoed from my pocket. I pulled out my secure tablet. The screen flashed bright red with an urgent top-tier security override notification. When my team had locked down the building, they had seamlessly integrated into the Vanguard internal surveillance network. I tapped the alert, pulling up a live high-definition security feed. It was the basement-level server room. The heavy steel doors had been propped open. A man was moving frantically between the massive server racks, ripping thick bundles of cables out of the mainframes. He was shoving heavy encrypted hard drives into a large canvas duffel bag with desperate, terrified speed. It was Marcus. He had not run out of the building to escape his screaming wife. He had run straight to the basement to steal the core financial data. I stared at the screen, a cold, predatory smile spreading across my face. Marcus was actively trying to flee the building with the stolen company hard drives. I did not waste a single second watching Richard's pathetic theatrical performance on the boardroom carpet. I turned on my heel, signaling the two closest members of my tactical security team. Sub-level 3, I commanded softly, ensuring my voice did not carry over the chaotic shouting of the federal agents. We bypassed the wreckage of the executive suite, entirely slipping out through the private side doors. The executive elevator dropped us toward the foundation of the building in complete, suffocating silence. I knew exactly where Marcus was going. A parasite always secures his host's resources before detaching. When the polished steel doors parted at the underground parking garage, the heavy scent of damp concrete, exhaust fumes, and burning rubber hit my lungs. The cavernous, dimly lit space stretched out before us, shadows hiding behind thick structural pillars. From the far end of the garage, near the reinforced service doors of the Vanguard primary server room, came the frantic, heavy scraping of metal and panicked footsteps. We moved swiftly, our footfalls entirely muffled. There he was. Marcus had backed his slate-gray Aston Martin directly up to the service entrance. The trunk of the sports car was popped wide open. He was practically vibrating with adrenaline and sheer terror, his perfectly styled hair now a damp, messy mop. He aggressively hoisted a massive reinforced canvas duffel bag over the bumper. The sharp rectangular edges of stolen Vanguard Enterprise servers and heavily encrypted data drives strained against the dark fabric. As he shoved the bag into the trunk, a silver crypto hardware wallet slipped from his trembling fingers and clattered loudly onto the grease-stained concrete. "Leaving so soon, Marcus?" My voice cut through the cold, echoing air like a sniper's bullet. He violently flinched, spinning around so fast he slammed his hip hard into the taillight of his car. He lunged for the driver's side door, desperately trying to slide into the leather seat, but a massive black Escalade belonging to my extraction team silently rolled out from behind a concrete pillar. It aggressively blocked his exit path, the heavy grille stopping mere inches from his custom bumper. Two more of my men stepped out of the shadows, physically barricading him against the side of his own vehicle. Marcus realized he was entirely trapped. The sudden suffocating panic in his eyes instantly boiled over into a toxic, volatile rage. His elite cultured tech CEO facade completely disintegrated, revealing the vicious cornered rat underneath. "You arrogant little bitch," he spat, his face flushing a dangerous mottled crimson. "You think you can corner me? I am a god in the tech sector. I am completely untouchable." He slammed his fist against the roof of his car, hurling a barrage of vicious, highly offensive, and intensely misogynistic slurs directly at my face. He called me an uneducated diversity hire, a pathetic interloper who got lucky, and a street-level fraud who had absolutely no idea how the real world operated. "I built algorithms that run laps around your pathetic holding company," he screamed, pointing a shaking finger at my chest. "Those servers belong to me. That crypto is mine. You are just a glorified secretary playing dress-up, and I have enough offshore capital to bury you in endless litigation until you rot." I did not raise my voice. I did not react to his venomous, pathetic insults. I simply pulled out my secure tablet and synchronized it with the garage's emergency public address system. "You are not a tech genius, Marcus," I stated flatly, my voice now amplified and echoing through the massive overhead speakers. "You are a parasite. You are a con artist who manipulated a desperate status-obsessed family for their capital, and you are incredibly sloppy." I tapped the glowing screen. "During our hostile takeover of the Vanguard network, my data extraction team flagged a highly encrypted hidden partition on those exact servers you are trying to steal right now. You genuinely thought hiding your personal audio files inside corporate tax folders was clever." I pressed play. The high-definition audio recording blasted through the damp concrete garage with inescapable clarity. It was Marcus's voice, accompanied by the distinct clinking of champagne flutes and the giggling of a woman who was decidedly not Victoria. "I know, babe, I know," the recorded Marcus laughed, his tone dripping with absolute sickening arrogance. "I just have to play the devoted husband for 6 more months. Victoria is an absolute nightmare. She is just this loud, insufferable, annoying Vanguard girl, a dumb trust fund brat who actually thinks she is royalty. But her father just wired the seed money into my holding account." The woman on the recording giggled louder. "So when do we leave?" she asked. "The second the liquidity hits the offshore crypto wallets." The recorded, Marcus replied smoothly. "I am draining every single cent of their capital, dumping it into cold storage, and we are on the first private flight to Dubai. She is a useless liability, and I am taking them for everything they have." The audio recording clicked into silence. Marcus stood absolutely frozen against his car door. The color completely drained from his face, leaving him a sickening shade of gray. His mouth opened, but no words came out. His absolute destruction was playing on a continuous loop in his own mind. But I was not the only one listening. A sharp, ragged gasp echoed from the concrete stairwell directly behind us. I shifted my gaze. Victoria stood in the shadows, clinging desperately to the heavy metal handrail. She had followed us down from the executive suite, frantically searching for her husband, searching for the one ally she thought she still had left in the world. Instead, she had heard every single humiliating, degrading word echoing across the parking garage. Her husband did not love her. He despised her. He had weaponized her marriage specifically to steal her inheritance. The sheer devastating shock on Victoria's tear-streaked face rapidly mutated into a terrifying primal rage. She let out a blood-curdling scream that ripped through the damp air. She charged forward with terrifying speed, bypassing my security team entirely. She lunged toward the open trunk of the Aston Martin, her hands blindly grabbing the first heavy object she could find. She pulled out a solid steel 9-iron golf club from Marcus's custom leather bag. "You parasitic bastard," Victoria shrieked at the top of her lungs. She swung the heavy metal club with the violent, unhinged force of a woman who had just lost absolutely everything. The steel head smashed directly into the center of the sports car's windshield. The reinforced glass shattered with an explosive, deafening crunch, sending a massive shower of jagged crystalline shrapnel raining down across the pristine leather interior. Marcus screamed, throwing his hands over his face and dropping hard to his knees on the concrete to avoid the flying glass. Victoria raised the club again, bringing it down viciously on the hood of the car, completely destroying the expensive metal with repeated hysterical blows. The sound of shattering glass was immediately followed by the aggressive screech of heavy tires. The underground garage was suddenly bathed in a blinding wash of red and blue tactical lights. 4 Boston police cruisers swarmed the loading dock, completely blocking all exits. A dozen uniformed officers flooded the space, their weapons drawn, shouting authoritative commands that echoed sharply off the concrete walls. 2 officers tackled Marcus to the greased floor, aggressively pinning his arms behind his back and snapping cold steel handcuffs around his wrists for attempting to flee with stolen corporate hardware. 3 other officers rushed Victoria, physically disarming her of the golf club and dragging her backward as she kicked, spat, and fought like a rabid animal being hauled away. I stood perfectly still in the flashing lights, watching the police drag the husband and wife away in separate directions, finally closing the book on their pathetic hollow empire. The echoing shriek of police sirens faded into the background as my extraction team efficiently cleared the underground parking garage. The Federal Bureau of Investigation had secured the stolen corporate hardware, and Marcus was already sitting in the back of an armored cruiser, his shattered pride reflecting in the broken glass of his ruined Aston Martin. The Vanguard Empire was systematically dismantled piece by piece, and by late afternoon, the entire commercial headquarters was completely secured under Sterling Holdings' control. The hostile takeover was a total, undeniable success. But I still had one final piece of property to reclaim. I left the chaotic crime scene behind and slid into the back of my waiting SUV. The drive across the city to the Vanguard luxury penthouse was quiet and deeply satisfying. I watched the sprawling Boston skyline blur past the tinted windows, reflecting the fading afternoon light. For a decade, Julian had treated this multi-million-dollar skyline property as his personal, untouchable sanctuary. It was his monument to generational wealth. Today, the deed reverted directly to me. My property appraisal team and a master locksmith were already waiting in the private marble-lined lobby of the residential tower. We stepped into the gold-plated elevator and I keyed in the executive override code, sending us shooting directly up to the top floor. The polished doors chimed and parted seamlessly, opening into the penthouse's private foyer. I stepped out and immediately stopped in my tracks. A young woman in her early 20s was standing aggressively in front of the custom mahogany double doors. She was heavily tanned, dripping in excessive gold jewelry, and completely barricaded behind a mountain of luxury shopping bags. Gucci, Prada, Louis Vuitton, and Chanel logos plastered the expensive paper bags surrounding her feet. She was frantically pounding her clenched fist against the heavy wood, completely oblivious to our arrival. She spun around, glaring at my security team with undisguised contempt. "Who are you people?" she demanded, her voice grating and shrill with unfiltered entitlement. "Are you the new cleaning staff Julian told me to expect the cleaners an hour ago? Open this door right now. Julian promised me this apartment, and I have been waiting out here freezing in the hallway for 40 minutes. I did not answer her. I simply signaled the locksmith. He stepped forward, entirely ignoring her pathetic tantrum, and inserted a heavy industrial drill directly into the custom deadbolt mechanism. "What do you think you are doing?" the mistress shrieked, lunging forward to physically swat at the locksmith's arm. "I am calling Julian right now. He is going to have you all arrested and fired. This is my penthouse." My security lead smoothly intercepted her, placing a massive, unyielding hand against her shoulder and effortlessly pushing her back into the wall. I pulled the master keycard from my tailored jacket pocket, bypassed the ruined locking mechanism, and pushed the heavy mahogany doors wide open. The massive sunlit living room stretched out before us, utterly empty of Julian's arrogant presence. I turned around and looked at the angry, panicked woman standing among her mountain of purchased luxury. "You are not going to reach Julian on his cell phone," I stated calmly, stepping over the threshold into my newly acquired property. "Julian Vanguard is currently sitting in a federal holding cell without bail. He has been formally charged with wire fraud, massive corporate embezzlement, and aggravated domestic battery. His entire company has been seized. He does not have a single dime to his name." The arrogant color instantly drained from her heavily contoured face. She clutched her diamond necklace, taking a shaky, terrified step backward. "You are lying," she stammered, her shrill confidence entirely evaporating into thin air. He is a billionaire. He gave me his black card this morning. He gave you a stolen corporate credit card tied directly to an embezzled federal account. I corrected her, keeping my voice absolutely rigid and devoid of any sympathy. Which means every single designer bag sitting on this floor, the diamond necklace around your throat, and the gold Rolex on your wrist were all purchased using stolen funds. The FBI is already tracking the purchase history. You are standing in an active crime scene holding stolen federal evidence. The crushing reality of the situation hit her with the devastating force of a freight train. She was not the pampered girlfriend of an untouchable billionaire. She was the unwitting accomplice to a massive federal crime caught red-handed with the stolen merchandise. Her knees violently buckled. She collapsed onto the marble floor, her expensive shopping bags toppling over and spilling silk scarves and leather shoes around her. Thick tears streamed down her face, completely ruining her perfect makeup. I did not know she sobbed loudly, her voice cracking with pure primal terror. I swear I did not know he was stealing it. Please do not let them arrest me. I cannot go to federal prison. She looked up at me, her eyes wide and frantic, desperately searching for a way out of the collapsing Vanguard empire. She scrambled forward on her hands and knees, grabbing the hem of my white pants, exactly the way Julian had done just hours earlier in the boardroom. I know things, she pleaded, her words spilling out in a panicked, rapid-fire rush. Julian talked to me. He used my personal phone to send encrypted messages because he thought his corporate phone was tapped. I have all his private text messages. I know the exact passcodes to the offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. He wrote them down in my personal notebook so he would not forget them. I will give you absolutely everything. I will hand over the phone and the passwords right now. Just please promise you will get me immunity. I looked down at the weeping, terrified woman. She held the final elusive keys to recovering every single cent Julian had tried to bury overseas. A slow, calculated smile spread across my face. Deal. I stepped back into the private executive elevator, leaving the sobbing mistress to her brutal reality check among her seized designer bags. By the time my security team navigated our armor-plated SUV out of the chaotic Boston city limits and merged onto the highway heading south toward the Hamptons, the sun was beginning to set over the eastern seaboard, casting long, dark shadows across the pavement. The evening news cycle did not just pick up the story of the Vanguard collapse, it entirely consumed it. Every single major television network, financial news channel, and digital media outlet interrupted their regular broadcasting to cover the unprecedented corporate implosion. My secure tablet illuminated the dark cabin of the SUV with an endless, frantic stream of breaking news alerts. The bold, flashing graphics scrolling across the bottom of the screens all mirrored the exact same devastating narrative. Vanguard Empire crumbles. Sterling heiress takes down corrupt husband. The global financial world was absolutely mesmerized by the sheer unmitigated brutality of the execution. There were no speculative rumors, no anonymous sources, and no corporate spin. There was only raw, undeniable footage playing on a continuous, inescapable loop. Someone in the Vanguard lobby had recorded Julian being frog-marched out of the building in federal handcuffs. The footage showed him surrounded by stern FBI agents, his face stained with terrified tears, his obscenely expensive suit rumpled and pathetic as he begged the cameras to stop filming. But the true viral sensation of the night was the security footage leaked from the underground parking garage. The internet was feasting on the high-definition multi-angle video of Victoria Vanguard swinging a heavy steel 9-iron into the windshield of her husband's sports car like a completely deranged banshee. The video captured the exact moment a Boston police SWAT team swarmed the garage, tackling Marcus to the concrete and dragging a kicking, spitting Victoria into the back of a squad car. The Vanguard family name, once completely synonymous with elite, untouchable wealth and corporate power, was now nothing more than a global punchline. Their reputation was completely eradicated. Hours later, the heavy wrought iron gates of my father's sprawling estate in the Hamptons swung open silently, welcoming me back to the true sanctuary of the Sterling family. The massive stone mansion sat perfectly illuminated against the crashing, violent waves of the dark Atlantic Ocean. I walked through the grand foyer, leaving my coat with the silent staff. The familiar comforting scent of aged wood smoke and cold sea salt grounded me instantly. My father, Victor Sterling, was waiting in his private study. The room was a fortress of dark mahogany paneling, leather-bound historical volumes, and a roaring fire that pushed the evening chill away. He stood perfectly still by the massive stone fireplace, a heavy crystal decanter resting on a polished silver tray beside him. He did not say a single word as I entered the room. He simply reached for two heavy-cut crystal glasses and poured a generous measure of 50-year-old Macallan Scotch into each. The amber liquid caught the dancing firelight, glowing with a warm, lethal intensity. He turned and handed me a glass, his dark, calculating eyes locking onto mine with a profound sense of absolute predatory pride. "You played a flawless game, Maya," he toasted, raising his glass slightly to meet mine. "You completely eradicated a parasite and secured our borders. You did exactly what a Sterling is born to do." I took a slow, deliberate sip of the scotch. The smoky, complex burn slid down my throat, a perfect physical manifestation of the victory radiating inside my chest. I turned slightly away from the fire, looking at my own reflection in the heavy panes of the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the dark, churning ocean. The woman staring back at me was fundamentally different from the woman who had lived in the Boston penthouse for the last decade. For years, I had carefully crafted and maintained the persona of the quiet, accommodating, submissive wife. I had intentionally dulled my own sharp edges, silenced my own predatory instincts, and played the exact role Julian Vanguard required to stroke his incredibly fragile ego. I had allowed myself to be severely underestimated by a family of arrogant fools. But looking at my reflection now illuminated by the firelight and holding a glass of victory in my childhood home, the final realization settled into my bones. I had not just shed a toxic, fraudulent marriage, I had completely shed a false skin. I had finally embraced the absolute terrifying power I was born to wield. I was a Sterling. We did not negotiate with predators, and we did not tolerate disrespect. We annihilated anyone who threatened our empire. The submissive, obedient Maya Vanguard was dead and buried. Maya Sterling had resurrected, and she was absolutely lethal. The heavy, satisfied silence of the study was suddenly shattered by a harsh mechanical buzzing. My personal cell phone vibrated violently against the surface of the mahogany desk. I set my crystal glass down on a coaster and walked over to the glowing screen. It was an unknown number, routed through a complex series of generic local area codes. I swiped the screen to accept the incoming call. A cold, robotic, automated voice filled the quiet room, broadcasting clearly over the phone's internal speaker. "You have a collect call from an inmate at the Suffolk County Federal Detention Center. Press 1 to accept." My father let out a low, dismissive scoff from his position by the fireplace. "Ignore it," Maya Victor commanded smoothly, taking another slow sip of his scotch. "He is a ghost. Let him rot in the silence he created." I stared at the glowing phone screen. Julian was sitting in a freezing concrete cell, completely stripped of his tailored suits, his stolen money, and his insufferable arrogance. He was desperately using his one allotted phone call to reach the exact woman he had spent years trying to manipulate and destroy. I did not decline the call. I reached out and firmly pressed the number 1 on the glass screen to accept the charges. A dark, deeply amused smile touched the corners of my mouth as the line clicked open. "Let's hear a dead man speak." The automated system clicked off. A harsh metallic hum replaced the sterile recording, carrying the distinct, chaotic background noise of the Suffolk County Holding Facility. There were muffled shouts, the heavy echoing slam of steel doors, and the frantic murmuring of desperate men. Then Julian spoke. "Maya." His voice was completely unrecognizable. It was small, fractured, and trembling with a raw, primal terror. The arrogant, untouchable billionaire who had spent the last decade terrorizing boardrooms and belittling his wife had completely vanished. In his place was a broken, panicked coward standing in a concrete room. "Maya, please," Julian begged, his breath hitching over the crackling line. "You have to help me. You have to get me out of here." I stood perfectly still by the massive stone fireplace in my father's study. The radiant heat washed over me, a sharp contrast to the absolute chilling calm settling deep into my bones. I held the crystal glass of Macallan Scotch, feeling the heavy, expensive weight of it in my hand. I did not say a word. I simply listened, allowing the silence to stretch and wrap tightly around his throat. The judge denied standard bail. Julian continued his words, spilling out in a frantic, sloppy rush. The FBI froze all of the domestic corporate accounts. They took everything in the Boston branches. But they set a cash bond, $5 million. Maya, I need you to wire $5 million right now. Call the legal team. Tell them to authorize the transfer. I cannot stay in here tonight. You do not understand what it is like in here. I took a slow, deliberate sip of the aged scotch. It burned with a smooth, smoky warmth. My father, Victor, remained standing near the window watching my reflection in the glass with quiet, predatory approval. He knew exactly what I was doing. I was letting the prey exhaust itself. When I still refused to answer, Julian's panic mutated into a desperate, pathetic attempt to regain his old authority. The familiar toxic gaslighting began to bleed into his trembling voice, a desperate reflex from a man who had entirely lost control. Maya, do not do this to me! Julian snapped, attempting to force a harsh edge into his tone. I know you are angry about the restructuring, but you need to be rational. You owe me this. You owe me your entire life. Do not forget where you came from before you put on my ring. You were a nobody. You were a quiet, useless girl with nothing, and I gave you the Vanguard name. I put a roof over your head. I fed you. I clothed you. I elevated you to a status you could have never achieved on your own. You owe me for taking care of you when you had absolutely nothing to offer. He was breathing heavily now, genuinely believing his own fabricated narrative. He still thought he was speaking to the submissive, terrified woman he had manipulated for 10 years. He had no idea he was speaking to the architect of his total annihilation. I lowered my glass. I did not yell. I did not raise my voice a single decibel. Anger is an emotion reserved for those who still view their opponent as a threat. I felt nothing but a clinical, icy detachment. My voice was smooth, flat, and lethal. You told me to leave with the clothes on my back because I had nothing without your last name, I stated calmly, the words slicing cleanly through the static of the jail phone. My real last name just liquidated your entire existence in 8 hours. Julian stopped breathing. The sudden suffocating silence on his end of the line was absolute perfection. I took the company, Julian. I continued, my tone conversational and relaxed. I seized the Boston headquarters. I seized the real estate portfolios. Your father staged a fake heart attack to stop the transfer, and my personal cardiologist exposed him as a fraud in front of your entire board of directors. Your brother Marcus is currently in a separate holding cell because my security team caught him trying to steal the mainframe servers. Your family is entirely destroyed. Maya, wait, please? Julian stammered, the false bravado shattering instantly. And before you try to comfort yourself with the thought of your hidden safety net, I said, leaning slightly closer to the phone. I stopped by the penthouse this afternoon. I changed the locks. Your mistress was waiting in the hallway with a mountain of designer shopping bags purchased with stolen federal funds. She was incredibly cooperative once I explained the prison sentences attached to wire fraud. Julian let out a strangled, breathless gasp. Your mistress gave me your offshore passwords. I delivered the final fatal blow. The Cayman accounts are empty. The hidden crypto wallets are completely drained. Every single cent has been reappropriated by Sterling Holdings. You have zero. The realization crashed down upon him with the devastating weight of a collapsing building. The offshore accounts were his absolute final contingency plan. Without them, he could not pay high-powered defense attorneys. He could not bribe his way out of federal indictments. He could not even afford a cup of coffee. He was completely, irrevocably destitute. A pathetic guttural wail echoed through the receiver. Julian began to sob. It was not a quiet, dignified cry. It was the loud, messy, hysterical weeping of a man whose entire universe had just been vaporized. He choked on his own tears, frantically babbling incoherent apologies, begging for forgiveness, promising to do whatever I wanted if I would just give him a fraction of the money back. I stood in the firelight listening to the symphony of his absolute ruin. It was the sweetest sound I had ever heard. I let him cry for several long, agonizing moments, absorbing every single ounce of his despair. "Enjoy the food in there," I whispered softly into the receiver, my voice cold and final. "I hear it is a lot like the charity you thought you were giving me." I pulled the phone away from my ear. I tapped the glowing red button on the screen, cutting off his frantic, sobbing pleas mid-sentence. I swiftly navigated to the settings and permanently blocked the incoming number. Then, with a smooth, effortless motion, I tossed the expensive cellular device directly into the roaring flames of the stone fireplace. The plastic casing immediately began to blister and melt, the screen cracking under the intense heat before going completely black. I turned my back to the fire, picked up my crystal glass of Macallan, and looked at my father. He raised his glass in silent tribute, and we drank to the ashes of the Vanguard Empire. Exactly 30 days later, the crisp, biting wind whipped through the concrete canyons of the city as my armored town car pulled smoothly to the curb. I stepped out onto the pavement and looked up at the towering glass and steel monolith that used to be the beating heart of the Vanguard corporate machine. The heavy, ostentatious gold lettering that had dominated the main entrance for decades, a monument to Julian's unchecked ego, was completely gone. In its place, a sleek, modern brushed steel sign caught the bright morning sunlight. It read simply and powerfully, "Sterling Innovations." The hostile takeover was finalized, the federal seizures were processed, and the rebranding was aggressive, swift, and absolute. I walked through the massive revolving doors, and the entire energetic frequency of the lobby instantly shifted. The hushed whispers, the condescending glances, and the dismissive smirks I used to receive when I played the role of the boss's quiet, submissive wife had entirely evaporated. Now the sprawling lobby fell into a stunned, reverent silence. Employees parted like the Red Sea as I walked toward the private elevators, offering deferential nods and terrified, respectful space. The transition team had spent the last 30 grueling days purging the deepest layers of corporate rot, but today was specifically reserved for severing the final, most infected limbs. I swiped my new master executive keycard and rode the private elevator directly to the top floor. The heavy double doors of the main boardroom stood wide open. The remaining senior members of the board of directors were already seated around the massive custom mahogany table. These were the old guard, the silent, complicit enablers, the men in bespoke thousands of dollar suits who had happily looked the other way while Julian embezzled federal funds and terrorized his staff, just so long as their quarterly dividends remained untouched and their offshore accounts grew. They had laughed at his crude, misogynistic jokes, covered up his aggressive, hostile takeovers, and systematically suppressed anyone who did not look or think exactly like them. I walked directly to the head of the table. The heavy, oversized leather chair, the one Julian used to sprawl in like an untouchable medieval king, was waiting for me. I did not sit immediately. I simply placed my sleek leather portfolio on the polished wood, stood perfectly straight, and looked at them. Arthur Pendleton, the senior vice president of operations, cleared his throat. He was a man who reeked of stale cigar smoke, expensive cologne, and unearned generational entitlement. Now Maya Arthur began offering a patronizing, tight-lipped smile as he leaned back in his chair. "We all want to commend you on managing the fallout from Julian's unfortunate legal troubles. You held up well under the media scrutiny. However, moving forward, this restructuring period is incredibly delicate. The markets are volatile, the media is circling, and the shareholders are understandably panicked. We have discussed it among ourselves, and we firmly believe it would be best if you stepped back and allowed us to steer the ship." Arthur paused, adjusting his silk tie as if preparing to deliver a profound compliment. "You can serve as the sympathetic public face of the company, the resilient wronged wife reclaiming her life. It is a great PR narrative. Meanwhile, we will handle the complex financial logistics and the heavy lifting behind closed doors." Another director, a silver-haired man named Thomas, who managed the International Logistics Division, chimed in, immediately nodding in vigorous agreement. Arthur is absolutely right, Maya. Corporate restructuring at this scale requires a firm, experienced hand. You have done remarkably well getting us through the scandal, but running a multinational conglomerate is simply not the same thing as redecorating a penthouse or hosting a charity gala. We need aggressive masculine leadership right now to project unshakable stability to the global markets. I let their insulting, deeply arrogant words hang in the sterile, air-conditioned air of the boardroom. I did not yell. I did not raise my voice a single decibel. I did not even frown. I simply opened my leather portfolio and pulled out 3 thick, meticulously prepared manila folders. With a flick of my wrist, I slid them smoothly across the polished mahogany surface. One stopped precisely in front of Arthur. The second stopped in front of Thomas. The third slid perfectly into the hands of William, the chief financial officer, who had actively helped Julian hide the illicit offshore accounts. "What is this?" Arthur demanded, his patronizing smile instantly faltering, as he flipped open the heavy folder and stared at the legal jargon printed on the first page. "Those are your immediate non-negotiable termination papers," I stated, my voice echoing with icy, absolute authority. "You are fired. Effective this exact second. You are being officially stripped of your board seats, your executive stock options, and your golden parachute severance packages." Arthur's face turned a mottled, furious shade of red. He slammed his hand against the table, rattling the crystal water glasses. "You cannot do this. We built this company. We are the board of directors. You are nothing without our backing and our industry connections." I leaned forward, resting my hands firmly on the table, locking eyes with him. "You did not build anything, Arthur. You enabled massive systemic fraud. You actively covered up Julian's embezzlement because it lined your own pockets. My forensic accountants have spent the last 30 days meticulously tracing every single illegal transaction you and Thomas authorized. You are incredibly lucky I am handing you termination papers right now, instead of handing your unredacted financial records over to the federal prosecutors currently dissecting your former boss." Thomas stood up, his face pale with sudden, terrifying realization. "This is corporate suicide. You cannot fire the entire senior leadership team in one morning. The stock will plummet. Who is going to run the divisions? You do not have the personnel or the expertise to replace us." I smiled. A cold, sharp, devastating, sterling smile. I reached out and pressed a button on the intercom console sitting in the center of the table. "Send them in." The heavy boardroom doors opened smoothly, and 3 women stepped into the room. I watched the arrogant color completely drain from the faces of the fired directors. The women standing in the doorway were the brilliant, fiercely dedicated, and consistently overlooked junior executives that Julian, Arthur, and Thomas had spent years suppressing, stealing from, and silencing. There was Elena, the brilliant data scientist who had single-handedly designed the algorithmic trading software that Thomas had proudly claimed as his own invention for years. There was Sarah, the operations manager, who had been passed over for the director role 5 consecutive times in favor of drastically less qualified men simply because she did not play golf at their exclusive country club. And there was Chloe, the razor-sharp legal mind who had actively tried to flag Julian's fraudulent offshore contracts before Arthur threatened to ruin her career if she spoke up. "These are your replacements," I announced, gesturing to the 3 highly capable, unshakable women who now stood shoulder to shoulder. They have the raw talent, the relentless drive, and the ethical integrity this company has desperately lacked for a decade. They are taking your corner offices, your bloated salaries, and your executive titles. The fired directors sputtered and grumbled, their fragile egos completely shattered by the sheer totality of their defeat. They angrily gathered their expensive fountain pens and custom leather briefcases, muttering bitter, impotent curses under their breath as they were systematically escorted out of the room by my private corporate security team. I did not bother to watch them leave. I finally took my seat. I sat down slowly in the chairman's heavy leather chair, feeling the material mold perfectly to my frame. I turned the chair slightly, looking out through the massive, pristine floor-to-ceiling windows. The sprawling, glittering expanse of the New York skyline stretched out endlessly before me. A brutal concrete jungle of raw power, fierce ambition, and limitless potential. The reflection staring back at me, in the flawless glass, was no longer a victim, and she was no longer a wife. The transition from scapegoat to boss was finally entirely complete. Exactly 6 months later, the dust from the Vanguard implosion had completely settled, leaving behind a stark and irreversible new reality. The corporate world moved swiftly, and the memory of Julian's reign had already been reduced to a cautionary tale taught in business schools. I had systematically dismantled their empire, but the true poetry of my victory resided in the personal ruins of the people who had tried to destroy me. Julian Vanguard, the man who once believed he owned the world, was currently adjusting to the rigid, unrelenting schedule of a federal penitentiary. The judge had shown absolutely no mercy during the sentencing. Julian was handed a mandatory 10-year federal sentence for wire fraud, corporate embezzlement, and aggravated domestic battery. He was entirely stripped of his tailored Italian suits, his imported leather shoes, and his insufferable arrogance. Now he wore an oversized, scratchy khaki uniform. He spent his days sitting on a rock-hard, thin mattress, in a tiny concrete cell staring at cinder-block walls. He had no offshore accounts to bribe the guards, no expensive lawyers to negotiate special privileges, and no family left to deposit commissary money. The absolute finality of a decade behind bars had broken his mind completely. He was a ghost trapped in a cage of his own making. His father, Richard Vanguard, the once mighty patriarch, who had dramatically faked a heart attack in a boardroom to maintain his grip on power, faced an equally humiliating fate. The federal government had seized his entire real estate portfolio, his pension, and his personal bank accounts to pay off the massive corporate restitution. With his reputation entirely toxic and his assets liquidated, Richard was forced to join the working class he had spent his entire life mocking. He now wore a bright orange, cheap polyester vest. He spent 40 hours a week standing on the hard concrete floor of a budget hardware store in a rundown strip mall, working as a front door greeter. Customers pushed past him without a second glance, entirely ignoring the bitter, defeated old man, handing out weekly sales flyers under the buzzing, harsh fluorescent lights. It was the ultimate daily humiliation for a man who used to command billions. And then there was Victoria and Marcus. The glamorous, vicious power couple had rapidly devoured each other the second the money disappeared. Victoria's violent outburst in the parking garage had resulted in a cascade of legal fees they could not afford. The high-powered divorce attorneys dropped them immediately when their retainers bounced. Now they were sharing a damp, cramped 300-square-foot studio apartment on the noisy outskirts of the city. The walls were paper-thin, the plumbing constantly leaked, and the air was thick with their mutual hatred. They spent their days screaming at each other and representing themselves in a messy, penniless divorce court. They were fighting viciously over cheap household appliances and mounting credit card debt. They were two desperate parasites who had completely turned on one another because the host they had been feeding on was dead. I left their pathetic realities exactly where they belonged and focused entirely on the future. Tonight was the pinnacle of the new social season. The grand ballroom of the Plaza Hotel was hosting the most exclusive, high society charity auction of the year. It was the exact type of event where this entire story began. Years ago, I had walked into this very room, trailing 2 steps behind Julian, playing the role of the quiet, submissive +1. I had worn a dress he picked out, smiled when he told me to smile, and endured the condescending whispers of the wealthy elite who viewed me as nothing more than a temporary charity case. Tonight, the dynamic was fundamentally different. When the heavy gilded doors of the ballroom swung open and I stepped inside, the entire gravitational pull of the room shifted instantly. The low hum of string music and the clinking of crystal champagne glasses ceased. A sudden reverent silence washed over the hundreds of guests. I wore a custom emerald green gown that was sharp-structured and entirely unapologetic. I was not trailing behind anyone. I was the center of the universe. Photographers clamored at the edges of the red carpet, their camera flashes illuminating the room in rapid, blinding bursts. The old money aristocrats and the corporate titans who had once looked down their noses at me now parted respectfully, offering deferential nods and eager smiles. I was no longer an accessory to power. I was the keynote speaker, and I was the single largest donor of the evening. I walked smoothly through the crowd, radiating a cold, untouchable confidence, and made my way up the steps to the main stage. The microphone rested on the sleek acrylic podium. I looked out over the sea of upturned faces, spotting the few remaining socialites who used to whisper cruel rumors behind my back. They were now looking at me with undisguised awe and absolute terror. I leaned forward. My voice rang out clear, commanding, and perfectly steady, echoing through the cavernous ballroom. As I spoke, the internal monologue of my journey played loudly in my mind, perfectly syncing with the reality of my triumph. They called me a charity case. They slapped me because they thought I was weak, submissive, and easily controlled. They thought they could break my spirit and use me as a convenient scapegoat for their own profound failures. But they forgot one fundamental rule of survival. The black sheep of a toxic family is usually the only one with the vision to see the rot. And I did not just see the rot, I completely incinerated it. The crowd erupted into deafening, thunderous applause. The standing ovation was absolute and unrelenting. I smiled a genuine, razor-sharp expression of total victory and stepped away from the podium. I did not linger for the handshakes or the desperate networking. My work here was done. I walked out of the grand ballroom, leaving the glittering gala behind. I bypassed the valet stand entirely. I did not need to call a cab, and I did not need a chauffeured town car. I stepped into the private executive elevator and rode it directly up to the roof of the building. The crisp, cool night air whipped my hair around my face as the elevator doors parted. The deafening, rhythmic thumping of heavy rotor blades vibrated through my chest. Sitting perfectly illuminated on the circular helipad was a massive matte black private helicopter. Emblazoned boldly on the side of the aircraft, shining under the landing lights, was the unmistakable silver sterling logo. The pilot gave me a sharp, respectful salute as I approached. I climbed into the luxurious leather cabin and strapped myself in. As the helicopter lifted off the pad, hovering for a moment above the towering skyscraper, I looked down at the sprawling, illuminated grid of the city below. The streets looked small, the buildings looked conquerable, and the world was entirely mine. I smiled into the dark cabin as the helicopter banked sharply and took off into the endless night sky. The most powerful lesson from this story is that being underestimated is a profound hidden advantage. Toxic people often mistake quiet observation for weakness, blinding themselves to their own vulnerabilities. This journey teaches us that true power doesn't require screaming or throwing tantrums. It requires patience, strategic execution, and the absolute courage to shed the false identities others force upon us. When you stop seeking validation from those who are committed to misunderstanding you, you reclaim the narrative of your own life. Never let a toxic environment dictate your self-worth. Have you ever turned being underestimated into your greatest strength? Share your story in the comments below.